Hello and welcome to this special edition of the interview here on France 24. Our guest today is the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba. He joins us from Ukraine. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Kuleba, today.
The pleasure is mine.
I want to begin with the situation in the port city of Mariupol. A second attempt to bring out civilians through humanitarian corridors this Sunday failed. Vladimir Putin blames the Ukrainian authorities. What happened?
Well, it's not us. It's Vladimir Putin who attacked Ukraine, who besieged the city of Mariupol, who uses airplanes to throw bombs on Mariupol, destroy all civilian infrastructure, kill people. So why would Ukraine be not interested in evacuating our compatriots from this terrible place? Of course, we are willing to do so, but unfortunately, the Russian army did not keep its word, and the channel did not work.
Are you going to attempt this for another time, or do you think it's too dangerous and the Russians definitely don't want this evacuation to happen?
We will make as many attempts as necessary, because for us, saving people's lives is utmost priority.
Right. There's another port city under threat, it appears. President Zelensky said this Sunday that the port city of Odessa was awaiting an impending assault from Russia. Is this the information you also have?
Odessa is not just a port, it's a big and beautiful city with splendid architecture and history. 100 years ago, French was easily spoken on the streets. Yes, the city is also on the verge of attack. It's preparing to defend itself. Our navy, our land forces, and also civilians who joined territorial defense, they are preparing to defend the city. The problem is that Russia is ruthlessly striking from the air with rockets and throwing bombs, indiscriminately killing civilians, and it's really difficult to fight against that.
Right. Are you also expecting an assault in the coming days on the capital, Kiev, obviously?
Fighting in around Kiev continues without any interruption. Unfortunately, the north, especially the north of Kiev, is the area of active combat. Our forces, they successfully repel attacks of the Russians, but Russian army throws more and more resources, more and more tanks and soldiers in an attempt to capture the city. Right. Their goal is to take the capital under control.
Right. Obviously, you've been advocating for a no-fly zone. NATO has refused. The U.S. has refused. Most Western powers have refused. How long can you hold without such a no-fly zone over Ukraine?
We have brave pilots who are ready to take off to the skies and fight Russian bombers themselves. But we need planes. So if NATO is rejecting the idea of a no-fly zone, then in order to save human lives, the lives of civilians, it should supply us with fighting jets and attack airplanes, which our pilots will fly and ensure the safety of our skies. Without it, if this doesn't happen and our airplanes are knocked out by the Russians, then everything that will be the responsibility for everything that will be happening on the ground, destruction, murder, rape by the Russian army, will be the responsibility for that will be shared between the Russians and those who did not help us.
Right. So this means you've lost hope in a no-fly zone. You're hoping that NATO countries will provide you with fighter jets. Is that correct?
No. If I had lost hope, I wouldn't have been speaking with you now. We are working on all possible ways how to support Ukraine, and my point is that if NATO is not ready to establish a no-fly zone now, then it should it should give us an alternative solution. That's it. That's the point I'm making.
Right. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, whom you met at the border with Poland yesterday, today said that there was a quote-unquote green light from NATO countries, indeed, to provide you with such fighter jets. So is this already happening? Are you getting jets or about to get jets from NATO countries to fight against Russia?
No, we are not getting them yet, and I'm not aware of any final decision taken in that regard.
Right. Another option would be for Ukrainian jets to use airports from neighboring countries. Is this also an option you're seeking?
Well, this is, I think this question should be addressed to our military guys and experts in military affairs. I have very low expertise in that. My job is to make sure that partners make political decisions on the supply of weapons to Ukraine, on imposing sanctions on Russia, and on supporting Ukraine with humanitarian aid. But when it comes to technical details, who flies from where, this is something that defense people should consider.
Right. Speaking of sanctions, Antony Blinken also said this Sunday that allies are having, I quote him, very active discussions about banning the import of Russian oil and gas. There have been a number of sanctions. This would be a rather drastic sanction. Are you calling for this? And do you have hope that this will indeed happen?
There is a war in the middle of Europe, the worst war since Second World War. The country is being destroyed by airplanes, by rockets, by missiles, civilians being killed, children being killed. I don't understand how, having such a war in Europe, someone can still buy Russian oil or gas, and that's why we call on all European, North American, and other countries to stop buying Russian oil and gas because it smells with Ukrainian blood.
And do you think that that could happen? Because obviously this has economic consequences for many countries in Western Europe. So are you hopeful that such a step will be taken in the coming days?
I believe that there is a solid moral ground for European countries to make such decision to stop the war. It doesn't mean that this decision should be taken once and forever, but as a measure to stop the war, to demonstrate to President Putin that he will be deprived of his revenues from trading oil and gas. This is, I think, the moral obligation of Europeans. If Ukraine fails, I want to be clear, if Ukraine fails, then Putin will feel emboldened enough to continue his hybrid warfare, to step up its hybrid warfare against Europe. So it's cheaper to help Ukraine now than to pay to stop Putin later.
Right. Vladimir Putin had yet another conversation with the French President Emmanuel Macron this Sunday. He told the French President that he would pursue Russia's goal either through negotiation or through war. Speaking of negotiations, that's obviously your job. There is supposed to be a third round of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia at the border of Belarus this Monday. Given the developments we discussed earlier in this interview on the ground, do you have any hope that those negotiations can succeed?
Well, I'm a diplomat. How can I not have hope in negotiations? We are preparing thoroughly for this next round of talks, but the success of these negotiations depends on one factor, that Russia approaches these talks in good faith and without dictating ultimatums, but seeking mutually acceptable solutions.
And from the first two rounds of talks and what has happened after that, I mean, are you going to continue talking, or at some point will you say, well, you know, what the Russians tell us at the negotiating table doesn't happen on the ground. Actually, the contrary happens, so we'll stop talking to Russia.
The nature of diplomacy in any conflict is that talks have to continue as long as there is the slightest chance for the success. It's true, we do not see the correlation between holding the talks and the intensity of fighting on the ground. Russia doesn't slow down, the Russian doesn't stop its forces while delegations are talking in Belarus. But nevertheless, we have to keep the diplomatic track alive.
Right. But when Vladimir Putin says that in his eyes Ukraine doesn't exist, I mean, he pretty much does what he says.
Well, Ukrainians are the Jews of the 21st century. President Putin follows the same logic as Adolf Hitler in the 30s and 40s. He believes that we do not have a right to exist, and he wants to find a final solution to Ukrainian problem. But we are fighting. We are fighting, and the blitzkrieg launched by President Putin against us failed. So now he's throwing more and more Russian soldiers into Ukraine. More and more of them get killed. Russia already suffered around 10,000 casualties in Ukraine. This is almost as much already as during the Chechen War. So we are fighting because we understand we are fighting for our land, for our country, for our right to be Ukrainians.
In his conversation with the French president, Vladimir Putin also said that Ukraine was responsible for what he described as the provocation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Your response to that?
Well, if a Russian tank fires at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, if Russian military unit attacks and takes the plant under control, so saying that it's Ukraine who bears responsibility for that, it's just a distortion, total distortion of reality.
Right. Are you concerned that he may attack other nuclear plants in Ukraine? Is that his plan, you think?
I think there is a risk of that. I don't know exactly whether it's part of his plan, but he may definitely do so.
Right. Just before we conclude, are there some contingency plans for President Zelensky from his government if there is indeed a full-fledged assault on Kiev, maybe to continue to govern from another place or another country?
Well, there is already a full-fledged assault on Kiev, but the president stays in Kiev together with the people of Kiev. I'm not aware of any contingency plans. We are not considering that option seriously because we see how the people of Ukraine are fighting for their country under the leadership of President Zelensky. And I have no doubts that we will prevail. The question is only the price. And if we receive all the necessary support from partners in weapons and sanctions, then this will allow us to save a lot of human lives and time. If we don't, the price will be much, much, much more higher. And unfortunately, as I said, partners will have to share responsibility for the death of these innocent civilians. But we will continue fighting until we prevail.
Right. Just as a conclusion, do you have a message for the French people, for people in the West and around the world?
I hope that the French people will understand that the cause Ukraine fights is a just one. And they will support our resistance to the aggressor who hates us, who wants to destroy us, but we are strong enough to fight against him and prevail. Be on the right side of history, be with us.
Dmytro Kuleba, I want to thank you very much for being with us in those very dire times for you and for your country.